Jason just mentioned the young ones in class. It's always good to be able to think about how many young people are here this morning and being taught. I know the past week or two at least, we've been rushing through the end of class, and I've neglected probably to mention it, but just as a reminder, if you are so inclined, if you think of something that you think might be helpful to the younger students, that could be high school students for that matter, any of the younger students, one of our goals this quarter is to be better able to teach, and sometimes you may not be the person standing in the class, but maybe you've contributed something that would be helpful to a class. So the picture up on the screen, which is also framed right here, is a good example of that. Our brother Brian Smith put that together. Christy Estes shared with us a little booklet that she put together that pertains primarily to what Jesus says about blessed are the pure in heart and applications of that. So these are two great examples of the kinds of things that you might be thinking of. It could be a set of questions about how to apply one of the Beatitudes or one of the principles we're going to discuss this morning. It might be a picture if you're artistic and would like to maybe portray something in a way that would be helpful as we're teaching other people. So whatever that is, I just don't want to forget to mention it. I would love for you to share that with me if you don't mind, and I'll be glad to share it with the class as well as put it into the resource room and make sure the teachers have access to whatever those things are that we create, that you create. So as we get into the lesson this morning, let's not forget that last part about showing the way or teaching is really one of the things that we're trying to do, but we also first need to make sure we understand what we're learning and that we are living that out. We are applying it to our lives, and so those are our objectives as they have been. We've talked about how Jesus focuses a lot of attention in his sermon on righteous living. We've talked about how that affects our disposition, or he addresses really our disposition. He addresses those things we're meditating on. He's addressing priorities that we make in our life. He's addressing the things that we say. And so far, as we've studied the lesson, we started off talking about how Matthew sets up Matthew chapter 5 by really helping us see that first John the Immerser and then Jesus following him were preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And so this is really an example of him preaching that gospel of the kingdom. And that gospel of the kingdom focuses on the character traits of those who would be a part of the kingdom as well as their influence on the world. We spent some time then talking about righteousness as it pertains to unrestrained or uncontrolled anger as well as various types of commitments. Today we're going to go on with that discussion and think about how Jesus teaches about righteousness regarding retribution, love, and hopefully, if we can make it this far, sincerity, which will actually take us into chapter 6. So as we're thinking about righteousness, who remembers one of the key verses that Jesus, one of the key phrases Jesus offers to us in verse 20 related to righteousness? What's the righteousness that's desired of those who are citizens of the kingdom? How's it compared to the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? Exceeding it. That's right, exceeding it. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So how is it that the righteousness that God desires exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees? What was wrong with the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? Elena?
Like they just viewed it more like a checklist.
Okay.
They just had to do it, follow all these rules, and our righteousness should be focused on love and loving each soul rather than just we have to do this because that's what God says.
That's right. So applying it in the way we think, our hearts, it really starts with our hearts. And so those character traits at the beginning of the sermon really help us understand that. And Jesus now is talking about the application of those character traits in a variety of different scenarios and situations. We're going to see in this next set of verses, beginning in verse 38, how Jesus describes righteousness as it regards retribution. So who would like to read verses 38 through 42 for us? Okay, go ahead.
You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you.
All right, so when we think about this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, one of the things I'm going to go ahead and direct our attention to is to a verse we're going to read in its context here in a few minutes. That's verse 48. Therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So as we're thinking about this topic of retribution and what Jesus says about that, let's remember that Jesus is going to really conclude his statements with this idea of seeking perfection the way God is perfect. And so what we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes directly applies to that. What does that mean, to be perfect as God is perfect? Let's remember that first. So let's go back and think about what Jesus says regarding what was said before. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Where does that statement come from? Does anyone know? Okay. Yeah, so there's a few places. In Exodus chapter 21 is one place we can go. And in this case, we see a specific situation that the law of Moses addresses. 2 men are fighting. One of them hurts or injures, hits a pregnant woman, and that causes some sort of difficulty with the pregnancy. And so the law of Moses said that if no harm came of it, that the man who caused the injury would pay a fine as imposed by the husband. But if there was harm, it says in verse 23, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. We read those words. What is it that the law of Moses is really seeking to impose upon men as it relates to a situation like this?
It's equal justice.
Okay.
Because in that time period, the wealthy would, if they were going to be punished by the law, they would just send their slave to be punished for them.
Okay.
Or they would pay it out some other way. They wouldn't be punished personally.
Okay.
So this was actual equal justice codified.
Okay. So would you say that what the law of Moses is doing is really regulating how punishment is meted out? In other words, it wasn't okay for the punishment to be too light or too severe. He doesn't say life for eye or eye for tooth. The idea is there's a punishment that fits the crime, and this was a civil punishment. This was something to be imposed by the people, by the law of Moses. Was this intended to be an excuse for personal retribution? No, it was not. As a matter of fact, we can go to Leviticus 24 and we can see another example, another application in the law of Moses related to the same topic, where the law of Moses said if anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given to a person shall be given to him. It's a regulation related to the punishment that would be imposed, but it wasn't about personal retribution. This is about the law of Moses, kind of like our laws today, our civil laws, impose a penalty for certain types of crime. Well, the law of Moses sought to do the same thing. This was the law for the nation of Israel. In Deuteronomy 19, verse 21, we see that the law of Moses said these things need to be done. It's not okay to overlook justice. He says, your eye shall not pity, it shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So as we understand that this was a civil penalty, a civil law, and we now look to what Jesus said about that. You've heard it was said to those of old, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or he actually says you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He's certainly hearkening back to something that is in the law of Moses. So why is he teaching something that someone might at first think of as being different than the law of Moses? Is that what he's doing? What's Jesus' purpose in the statements he makes following, you've heard it was said, but I say to you? Why is he teaching something different? Jimmy?
I think he's talking about more of the state of mind.
Okay.
Because it's easy if somebody harms me, I want blood.
Yeah.
I want to. It gets into that retribution rather than a punishment, and the way we think about that.
Yeah.
So I think he's trying to get across the state of mind. You know what? If somebody harms you, we need to think the best of them. We need to basically give them the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Not want justice.
Okay. Okay. And so let's go back to verse 20 again. Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of scribes and Pharisees, do you think there was a misapplication of the law of Moses by some of the religious leaders and people? Stephen, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think on the flip side of this, I think this passage is used to maybe remove a Christian's authority to defend against abuse.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I can't help but think about 2 Corinthians 11 and that whole section when Paul
Yeah.
says things like, those brethren were gladly putting up with people that were putting into the bondage, devouring you. If one takes from you, one exalts himself, and one strikes you in the face. The same wording, right?
Right.
Okay, well, I'm not. It doesn't prevent me from defending against abuse.
Right.
What we're talking about is something that's, hey, it happens. What is your response? What's
Yeah.
your response to that one occasion? It doesn't mean I'm now going to bow to just being abused by someone. In this case, they were religiously
Yep.
like overpowering them and physically abusing.
That's
them.
right.
And so Paul is not just removing our self-worth.
That's
in
right.
that situation.
That's right. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that in just a moment. And before we get there, I want you to notice something that Jesus is going to say in just a few sentences, something we're going to study in a few weeks. Jesus said, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." This is certainly speaking about this idea of judgment and being not hypocritical in judgment. But in particular, if we think about what is expected, when we think about something that is truly just, we're thinking about things like, well, I'm looking at things the way God looks at things. God's judgment is just, but merciful as well. Are you going to judge someone or hold someone to a standard you don't want to be held to? Well, if we think about how the scribes and Pharisees applied the law of Moses as it pertained to an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, do you think they were justly applying that law? Were they applying it equally to themselves as they were to other people? No, it was really about their own desire for retribution. And so, when we think about that standard, let's not forget that the law of Moses, even though it regulated and certainly imposed a penalty for crime, the law of Moses in Leviticus 19, verse 18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. You shall love your neighbors yourself. I am the Lord." That's not a new teaching in the gospel. This is something that God had expected. Not seeking personal retribution, not seeking vengeance, loving one's neighbor. In Romans chapter 12, Paul would later say, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So there's a consistent message. When we apply the gospel of Christ, we see Jesus really harkens back to the standard that God had set even in the law of Moses. And prior to that, yes, there's to be justice, but that justice was not meted out by individuals who are seeking retribution and unfairly or unequally applying the law. No. Our concern is really for those around us. Our concern is, yes, for justice, but also for mercy, not seeking personal vindication. Back in the Old Testament, Proverbs chapter 25, verse 21, "If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. For you will heap burning coals on his head, as the Lord will reward you." That reminds us of what Paul wrote, doesn't it? Paul was thinking about things from the Old Testament. So when we think about overcoming evil with good, I believe that is one of the applications we can make from what Jesus teaches here. He says, "Do not resist the evil person," in verse 39 of chapter 5. He says, if anyone wants to sue you, take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you. Now, Stephen made a very good point, and it's something we need to think about. There is a difference between personal protection and personal retribution. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
There's a difference. And we see holy, righteous men who fled for safety. We can see times like in Matthew chapter 26 where Jesus is about to be arrested. Peter pulls out the sword. What does Jesus tell him? Put the sword away, right? But there's other times where in Luke chapter 4, Jesus himself rose up and went away from danger. They were going to throw him off a cliff, and he fled from that. In John chapter 8, so they picked up stones and threw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. John chapter 10, again they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. Jesus himself didn't just necessarily expose himself to violence. Yes, there would come a time when he allowed himself, just as the Apostle Paul did. The Apostle Paul knew if he went to Jerusalem, there was difficulty awaiting him there. There would be persecution. He knew there was difficult things coming, and he went into that situation anyway. There is an obligation. There is a factor of following through on your commitment to God, even if it causes you physical harm. But that doesn't mean that I necessarily am just going to go expose myself to harm just in the name of trying to, I guess, honor God by doing so. Joe?
Paul also knew when to invoke his rights as a Roman under
Yeah.
civil law. These things that are listed are really kind of nuisance things.
Yeah.
Yes, you could take someone to court to sue them for a piece of clothing, but even a judge would roll his eyes at you over that.
Right.
These are nuisance things. And so really the application to me is if it's just a matter of nuisance, I just need to take the loss and get over it.
Yeah. I like to think about what Jesus said in verse 39 and really think about that really happening. Somebody slaps you on the right cheek. Well, what's your reaction?
That's my reaction.
That's your reaction?
It's my genuine reaction, but it needs to be better.
And that's kind of what we're getting at here, right?
Exactly.
That what Jesus says is that there is a tendency of the flesh to seek retribution, right? I'm going to mete it out right now. I've got that opportunity. We're not talking about protection. We're just talking about somebody does something to me, I want to do it back to them. And Jesus is telling us, no. Jesus is telling his disciples, that's not the state of heart that describes a kingdom citizen. So what are those characteristics that we've studied already that seem to relate most closely to what Jesus teaches here? Think about the Beatitudes again. What are some of them that come to mind, Jimmy? Meekness. All right, so that's the idea of strength but under control. It's very good. What else? Peacemakers. Absolutely. What else? I've got some up here come to my mind. Yeah, persecuted, right? Very good, Ben. Thank you. What's that?
Poor in spirit.
Poor in spirit. Yeah, one is humble. I'm not seeking vengeance. That's not a sign of humility. Certainly, we're going to see through this section of Scripture, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake certainly fall into this category of those who Jesus is specifically addressing. Times of persecution do come. And it's not up to me to try to seek vengeance or try to make sure that justice is served just because I feel like it needs to be. Okay? Ben?
And you see a change too with Peter from cutting the ear of the soldier, Malchus, I think that was his name, to Acts chapter 5, where him and the apostles are rejoicing for the fact that they have suffered for the name of Christ.
Yeah. Absolutely. Really good point. Really good point. Well, let's carry that forward then, because this next section is, I think, closely related to the last. What Jesus teaches about personal retribution is closely related to what he teaches about love. So would someone read verses 43 through 48 for us? Chuck, would you do that?
You have heard it, that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you or persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For tax collectors do the same? If you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Okay, so Jesus here goes further in his teaching and points out that the religious leaders are teaching something that I can't find in the law of Moses. What are they teaching?
Yeah, Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So maybe their own traditions or their own interpretation.
So what were they teaching specifically? What does he say? You shall love your neighbor and what?
Hate your enemy.
Hate your enemy. Right? Where in the Old Testament do we see a command related to hating your enemy? Now, certainly we do see some language that, for example, in the Psalms, where David talks about hating the enemies of God with perfect hatred. He's putting the things of God first in that psalm. He's thinking about the things that are viewed through the eyes of God, not through his own eyes. Nowhere do we see, as far as I can tell, anything in the Old Testament that says, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. As a matter of fact, that's just the opposite of something we've already looked at. Notice in Exodus chapter 23, in verse 4, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. Does that sound like hate your enemy? So we're not really talking about the way one might feel. When we read Exodus 23, what was a reflection of how one treated his enemy? Was it based on how he felt about the enemy? No, it was based on, again, viewing things through the eyes of God, giving glory to God, honoring God's law. So don't refrain from helping your enemy. In Romans chapter 13, verse 9, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So if we want to look back to the law of Moses and see how that's applied, well, the law of Moses that said these are commands, not committing adultery, not murdering, they're all summed up by that last statement. And that was also part of the law of God for the Jewish people and for the people of God today. In 1 Samuel 24, you'll remember that Saul has been pursuing David. Saul has tried to kill David. And so here Saul finds himself in a cave, and unbeknownst to him, David's in the same cave along with his men. David has every opportunity now to kill Saul, to seek retribution, to maybe even protect himself because Saul is trying to kill him. And the men of David said to David in verse 4, I'm backing up a little bit from what's on the screen. 1 Samuel 24, verse 4, the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. So the men of David are saying, hey, here's the day. God said he's going to deliver your enemy into your hand. This is it. Let's go for it, David. What's David's response? David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and afterward David's heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to the men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went his way. What lesson do we learn about loving one's enemy from David? How would you describe that? How do you think David felt about Saul? Chrissy?
We don't have the right to take revenge. We don't, just because we feel it. God has given what he's given. This was God's anointed. Who is David to go above what God wants?
Okay. And
Who am I to,
Well, that's right. And what was it that was special about Saul in the eyes of David? The Lord's anointed. I think about this passage sometimes when I think about, well, it really applies to many different situations. Nikki brought up one a couple of weeks ago when you think about a situation where there's a married couple and there's some abuse and things going on in the household. When we think about Saul being God's anointed, he was anointed as king. What David is really recognizing about Saul is that God appointed him to that role, and David saw himself as being a subject to God, certainly first, but also respectful of the fact that God gave Saul this role as king. Well, in a marriage relationship, certainly an abused spouse, I believe, has every right to flee from a violent, dangerous situation. But is there a special relationship that needs to be honored in the eyes of God? There is. This is a covenant before God. Now, that could be applied to many other situations. It could be applied where maybe there's some government oppression against me personally. And while I may seek to flee from that danger, I recognize God's anointed. I need to recognize and not seek to speak against or to try to somehow violate that which God has anointed over me. So there's numerous different applications of this. It's just David's attitude towards Saul so much impresses me because Saul was God's anointed. Bethlehem?
Like, to your point, I kind of think of it like just because they're in that role doesn't mean they're living up to their role in an honorable
That's
way.
right.
But it's the role that you're honoring.
Yeah.
Not necessarily you're deserving of respect. That's why I honor you. I respect you because you are in this role.
Yeah.
Kind of like, I mean, with marriage, like, you're not always going to get along with your husband. Sometimes your husband makes decisions that maybe you don't agree with.
And you do lots of chores.
We're good.
All right.
You always have to say that. No, but I'm saying, like, at the end of the day, there are times when maybe Alex is like, we're not doing that, and I have to go, okay. And I don't, and it's just part of honoring the role he was put in. At the end of the day, like, he kind of got last say on whatever it was. So I just think of it like you don't honor them because, he's a good guy. But if they aren't a good guy, you honor them because that is the role God gave them, and you honor God, and that's why you honor this person's role.
I agree with that. Chuck?
I think it's whatever relationships we have, whether it's our spouse or work or anybody, that we make sure we keep our relationship with God first.
Yep.
Right? And it's about between me and God more so before anything else.
Yeah.
And the rest kind of falls into place. Sometimes it's hard. But
Yeah, it is.
But keep that true north, some people call it.
That's right. Joe?
Well, and we trust that the person, if the person is not fulfilling their role honorably, God will judge that. God will handle that. That's what those imprecatory psalms are about.
Yeah.
David's calling on God to bring judgment
Yeah.
on people who deserve it.
Yeah.
He's not saying, Lord, let me go do it. He's saying, bring judgment on these nations or these evil people that deserve it.
Very good. Zach?
But at the same time, we see this verse and you see his heart in
Yeah.
the moment. It wasn't about seeking vengeance against those people. It was about seeking justice.
Yeah.
And God's justice, not his own.
Okay. Very good. Stephen?
So, Jesus serves as our example in this, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at 1 Peter 2:21 and following, it says he was leaving us his example as he was reviled, but he did not revile in return.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He suffered, he did not threaten, he committed himself to him who judges righteously.
Mm-hmm.
So he is our example.
Absolutely.
And they were definitely his enemies.
Absolutely. Ben?
I just think this is a great example. I wrote it next to Matthew 5, blessed are the meek, because David has power, he has opportunity, he could get away potentially, and he restrains, what he could have done. I think that's a great example of meekness in action.
Yeah, absolutely. Riley?
That's one thing that I find interesting about this is David did have the opportunity to kill Saul if he wanted, but he was pricked in the heart by cutting the corner of his robe. And so David was seeking Saul's best interest, the best for Saul, and that's what ended up convicting him.
Yeah.
Stephen's point, like I was thinking about Romans 5:8, where while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, and just reflecting the character of Jesus in
Yeah.
that. Like, if Jesus had our human perspective, he wouldn't have died for these people who didn't deserve it.
Right.
And so that's like how we should approach our enemies.
Yeah. You know, what do you recall the first chapter of 2 Samuel and what David said about Saul and Jonathan? Maybe second chapter of 2 Samuel. Saul and Jonathan are dead. What does he say about them? What were we saying?
Just the love that they had for one another.
Absolutely. That he had for Jonathan. Does he speak against Saul? I can't really find examples of that, where David is going out and trying to plant these seeds among the people about how terrible Saul is. He's praising Saul with his mouth. Even though Saul's trying to kill him, he's praising Saul. And even after Saul's dead, he's praising Saul. He's praising Saul. And he will not let his men go out and harm Saul. And he even feels regret for cutting off the corner of Saul's robe, even a small thing like that. Just shows us the heart of David, and certainly, as Stephen pointed out, Jesus is the perfect example of this, how he did not revile in return, but he demonstrated love completely. We can see this carried out in a variety of ways. We can see it depends on which translation you're reading as to which specific things are mentioned. In the New King James, Jesus says, "Bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you." In the, I think, New American Standard, the ESV that we were reading out of up on the screen, those are left out, but it specifically says to pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. When we think about the things that Jesus says to do, to pray for, to greet, are those things that are reactive in nature? Those things are easy to do when you're being persecuted or harmed in some way by someone else? These are challenging things that Jesus says are expected of those who are part of the kingdom. To bless those who curse, to pray for those who are spitefully using you, to greet those, that is to speak well of, right? To try to be kind, to try to be at peace. So let's think about what Jesus says at the end of chapter 5. Of course, we have this sermon divided into chapters. It wasn't divided into chapters by Jesus. This is just part of the flow of the sermon. In verse 48, "Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." What is it that causes one to be perfect in the sense that Jesus uses that word in verse 48? Jimmy?
Just wanting the best for everyone.
Okay.
As just loving everyone like our Father
Okay.
loves everyone, even evil people. He wants them to be right. And they may not be there at that point, but that's the attitude we need to have.
Yeah.
We want the best for everyone.
Sometimes when we think about perfection, we're thinking about sinless perfection. That's not the context of what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is talking about being perfect as God is perfect, and that is manifested in our disposition towards other people, even our enemies. God's disposition towards his enemies was to rescue them, to save them, to give his own son to die for them. That was his disposition. What are we willing to yield or give up for the benefit of someone else, even if that someone else is not our favorite person, even if someone else is actually trying to harm us? Do we pray for them? Do we greet them? Do we do what we can to foster an environment where there could be peace, where there could be, and remember when we talked about peacemaking, you remember how we said the ultimate peace, or the foremost peace, the most important peace is peace with who? Peace with God, right? Peace with God. And so if we desire peace with God ourselves, we're not just, if we're truly peacemakers, I should say, we're not just seeking peace with God for ourselves, but really seeking that peace with God for others. And so loving the unloving is one of the ways that we truly become perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. So as we reflect on the various character traits that specifically apply to this, some of the same ones obviously we talked about a few minutes ago would apply. What else would you say do you feel like specifically applies to loving our enemies as God loved us? Okay. Yeah. takes a single-hearted devotion to God, that purity of heart, absolutely. What else? Nikki?
Patience, being able to like delay what we want, our desires, to wait for God to take care of it.
Yeah.
That might not even be in this life.
That's what?
That might not even be in this life. It might be,
Oh, yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
well after we're gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I heard a sermon recently that was talking about like letting your light shine, and I know it's kind of obvious, but letting your light shine is a choice that Jesus expects us to make, and so like choosing to love people even when they're kind of unlovable is a way that we let our light shine.
Yeah.
It's different from everybody else.
You know, thanks for reminding me of that. That's when we studied the early part of the sermon, we looked at verse 11 and 12 where Jesus said, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven." It's very impressive that right after he says that, that's when he talks about the salt and the light. We are the salt of the earth, the light of the world, and one of the ways that we are that is when we demonstrate love for those who aren't showing love for us, right? Returning good for evil. Ben?
What Riley just said, I think, is really impactful. Loving the unlovable, and it can be easy for us to forget. You know, that's us as well.
Yeah.
While we were yet sinners, He died for us. So
Yeah.
sometimes there's a disconnect of, you know, who we are, or maybe just forgetting what God has done for us. You know, He's forgiven us, so the natural response, Colossians 3, is to forgive one another.
Yeah.
So he really takes it away from the fact of maybe it shouldn't be as hard as we are making it.
Yeah.
You know, even with King David, looking at King David, and we typically think about his sin with Bathsheba, which he did. He committed that sin. We would never do anything like that, quote unquote. Man, look how bad, look how far down he went. His heart here. This is sometimes where we struggle the most.
Yeah.
Not with adultery, but with retribution, or you know, just all these different things of I have to get even, or you know, I've been taken advantage of. You know, so it's a really impactful thing to consider, just that restraint that he had with the power that he had.
And perhaps this is one of the primary reasons that David's called a man after God's own heart. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. A man after God's own heart, your desires aligns with God's desire, right? And David demonstrated that in his attitude towards Saul. And so many of the things we've discussed would in the Beatitudes certainly seem to apply here, don't they? So as then we think about applying this to ourselves, so going the way, that is, am I walking in this path? There's a challenging, perhaps, question. I think it's on page 32 of your workbook. I'm going to ask you just to take about 30 seconds and consider that question, considering a scenario where you've been emotionally challenged to show love for someone. Think about what good thing you could do, should do, would like to have done perhaps, in keeping with the principles of returning good for evil. Just think about that for yourself for a few seconds. Would anyone like to share kind of what first comes to mind as you think about that? Go ahead, Carol.
God says we should love one another with brotherly love and what have you, and what I have attempted to teach some of my kids, that we love them, but you don't have to like what they do.
Okay.
There is a difference, and we should know that difference and apply it to ourselves more often than we do.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Caitlin?
I think nowadays it's kind of like trendy to, like a lot of people will talk about how like protect yourself and like walk away and don't put yourself in like hard situations. And I think loving our enemies or showing love for someone that's hard is putting ourselves in uncomfortable situations and doing the hard thing and like sticking with it for them because we love them and care for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what you're saying there. Yes, it's sometimes, at least for me personally, it's been easy if I felt like somebody wasn't showing enough regard for me. You know, fortunately, I've never been slapped in the cheek. You know, I've never had that experience as Jesus described specifically. But so, certainly for me, sometimes it's easy to say, well, I'm just going to pray for that person. And that's important. I need to be praying for that, but sincerely praying for that person. What might seem even more challenging, at least for me, is to actually go and proactively try to be at peace with that person, if that person's amenable to it, open to talking, asking, is there something that I need to make right? Is there something, kind of goes back to what we looked at earlier in chapter 5 about if you come to the altar and remember your brother has something against you. Am I truly interested in being at peace, even with those who I feel like are not treating me fairly? Any other thoughts on that, Stephen?
You know, sometimes this whole concept of showing love to somebody who's really treating you as an enemy is very difficult if it's a family member that you believe is really your enemy.
Yeah.
At some time in your life. And so to continue to love them, but also point out in a loving way the things that need to change in order for there to be peace
Yeah.
in the family, or holding God's line on how a father should treat a mother or a husband or wife or whatever that looks like
Right.
for the children. It's just that's really challenging, but we need to do that. And we need to continue to pray and be kind and
Yeah.
not allow ourselves to go down the path of sin
Yeah.
and mistreating them in some way or disrespecting them in some way. I mean, always continue to honor them and love them the way we should. Those are some of the, I think, more challenging aspects. I mean, I've had to do some of those things in challenging times in my nuclear family when I was growing up and those kind of things, and I could have done a better job.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Ben?
Just to add on to that, Jesus wasn't passive or passive aggressive in the sense of when there was an issue, he seemed to confront it. Paul did that even like with Peter. Alexander, the coppersmith, has done me much harm. Be aware of him. So I think with this, there can be a tendency for me to, hold certain emotions or feelings inside, and then that can fester into something else.
Yeah.
Where it would actually be better, like what Stephen was saying, to go to that person and to be willing to have that confrontation, not to, for something bad to happen, but to actually express, here's why you upset me, or here's how you hurt me. That could actually open up some doors, but it could also protect my heart as well from sitting on something for a couple of years and never saying anything to that person, which could then foster walls that are unseen or unknown, which eventually will tear you apart.
Okay.
just a quick thing.
Sure.
This idea of who's lovable is that's a big concept.
Yeah.
Everyone is lovable because Jesus died for them.
That's right.
And he died for me. But also putting our faith in God's power to change people, and that repentance can happen. Never giving up on God's word to change something.
Yeah, I never thought about it. In what you just said kind of made me think about something we talked about earlier. Saul was God's anointed, and David regarded Saul for that reason. And there's a sense, you could say, in which all men are anointed in the sense that Jesus died for them. They have worth, they have value. Even if they're repulsive to me in their behavior, they have worth, they have value. And I need to respect that, right? I need to honor that in the way I treat other human beings and recognize I'm going to leave the door open for there to be opportunities for us to be at peace with each other. It may not be possible, they may not be willing. And certainly as it applies to marriage, it seems to come up, it's come up several times this morning already. Again, I know that sometimes in a marriage, it seems even harder at times because you're living with that person and there becomes conflict, and that conflict starts creating a wedge that gets wider and wider. And sometimes it's harder to go to your own spouse and try to seek peace than maybe it is somebody that you just see typically on Sundays and Wednesdays, right, at the church building or something like that. That can be a very challenging thing as well. So loving others as God loves them, seeking their best interest, even when they don't have ours at heart, really, really good. So we're going to spend a few minutes getting into chapter 6. Don't know how far we're going to get, but we're going to start by reading the first 18 verses together. And then we're going to break that down because I believe Jesus helps us as he's, so far, what we've seen, by the way, here at the end of chapter 5, is Jesus saying, you've heard it was said, but I say to you. So we get into chapter 6, and he's going to use a little bit different language in thinking about how to apply these characteristics we've been talking about in true righteousness. All right, so let's read the first 18 verses together. Would somebody mind volunteering to read those 18 verses? Paul?
Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward himself you openly. And when you pray, you should not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut the door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Therefore do not be like them, for your Father knows the things that you have need of before you ask him. In this manner, therefore, pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. So let's think about verse 1 as we're ending class today. Verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. What did Jesus say about righteousness back in chapter 5 and verse 6? Blessed are those who what? Hunger and thirst for righteousness. What did he say about righteousness in verse 10 of chapter 5? Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. What did he say in verse 20? Unless your righteousness exceeds what? Here in chapter 6, verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people. How does that apply to what Jesus has already said about righteousness in those earlier verses?
It's part of exceeding the scribes. Pharisees was they were very physically minded with it.
So when we're looking next week at the idea of benevolence, prayer, and fasting, keep in mind one of the primary differences we're seeing between the practices of the day and what Jesus desired was outward obedience versus obedience from the heart. True devotion to God. That's what Jesus has talked about already. That's what he's going to talk about here in chapter 6. Thank you so much for your participation in class today. Look forward to next week.